But one of the ways we got started with, particularly with cereal rye as a cover crop, is I had been at some national farm meetings that were outside of Minnesota and were encompassed people from a broad geographic area, and people were talking, farmers were talking about how they were using cover crops and how it was an important part of their farm and how they were reducing their tillage, and they were actually using the cover crops as a substitute maybe for some of the tillage they'd done in a no-till system, and trying to get some better soil structure. And it was one of those things that I was convinced would not work on our farm. And I just attributed it to, well, it might work in 4 hours south of here along Interstate 70, or maybe 2 hours south of here on Interstate 80, and here we are 30 miles north of Interstate 90. And I was convinced that it just could not work in our neighborhood. And yet, after a couple of years of hearing some of my friends from outside the area talk about it, I finally got to the point where I had to prove them wrong. And I had to show them that it would not work. So I hired the local co-op to spread some rye seed that I'd bought. And after we had harvested soybeans and actually had spread manure on the field, we they used an airflow and they spread the rye, and we field cultivated it in. And sure enough, that fall, nothing really happened. Maybe it grew an inch or so, and I thought, yep, that's it. I won. I proved them wrong. And then the next March, I could actually see the field from our kitchen window. And the next March, as the snow was melting, the field was starting to turn green, which I thought was a little odd. And I showed how naive I was, because I really didn't realize that the growth actually happens in the spring. And we got busy getting ready for spring planting, and sure enough, we started planting corn before we were all totally ready for the season, as a lot of us are, and we're kind of getting ready as we're planting. And the planter and the field cultivator started at the other end of the field and started marching across the field. And it was a pretty good sized field, and by the time the field cultivator got to the rye, my brother, who was operating the field cultivator, called me on the two-way and he said, "You'd better get up here. This rye is really a disaster." And he had pulled into the rye, and it, with the field cultivator set the same way it was in the rest of the field, that was pretty much conventional tillage, all going to corn, soybean residue. And he hit the rye, and it was just a bunch of root balls. And it looked like a disaster to plant into. So I'm really glad he stopped. But in that way, we became reluctant no-tillers, because the planter was only about a half a day away behind the field cultivator. And we had to figure out how to no-till into standing rye. And it turned out that year to be one of the best yielding areas of the field. And normally, the spot that we picked for the rye would have normally been the worst yielding area of the field. Wow. So it was enough to give us encouragement to say, well, let's try a little more next year. So that first year we did about 40 acres, and for about the next 5 years we doubled our rye acres every year. And now we're at a point where it doesn't necessarily always fit on every acre, but it is certainly a very comfortable practice to us. It's much more comfortable for corn stalks going to soybeans. That's kind of almost a no-brainer for us. It's our preferred way to do that. Or if we're doing corn on corn and we're using strip till, that's a really nice fit. We use rye for that. It's a little harder for us to do rye into soybean stubble in a pure no-till corn situation, but we have some farms where we've done that successfully a couple times now in the rotation. So we're maybe 5 or 6 years deep into a pretty much rye every year rotation with corn and soybeans as the summer crops. We truly do believe it is a way to farm that will leave the farm in better shape year after year. And if I can think about improving organic matter in our soils, that is a huge win as far as our long-term profitability. And we slice and dice data a number of different ways, and have been using, like a lot of people, yield monitors and combines for several decades now, back to the mid-90s. And we quickly began to associate our better yielding spots of the farm to a number of attributes, and one of them is organic matter. And if we can maintain or improve our organic matter, long term we feel that's a win for our farm's profitability.